Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, dignitaries, family members, conference organizers, importantly, serving members, veterans. I want to, on behalf of Master Corporal and myself, I want to thank the conference organizers as well as the leadership of the Royal Canadian Medical Services and CanSoftCom in entrusting us in presenting on a very important topic, the Arctic. And not only that, the fact and focusing on our members who answer the call, who serves the mission to assert Canada's presence and sovereignty in what is probably one of the most difficult areas to operate in the world. And we owe it to those people that we're able to support them and bring them back home when necessary. As per conference policy, we're just presenting the fact that there is no conflict of interest or mitigation bias. Canada is an Arctic nation. That is the opening statement of Canada's Arctic foreign policy that was published in 2024, December of this past year. In it, the Government of Canada stipulates three main priorities for this: asserting Canada's sovereignty, advancing Canada's interest in the region, and promoting a stable, prosperous, and secure North. The reason for this is because, essentially, the Arctic is melting. The Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than any other parts of the world. And because of that, the Arctic, which initially and for a very long time was seen as impenetrable in our defense in a certain way in protecting the head of North America, is now becoming passable. And what that does is that it's certainly opening shipping routes and presence of nations and adversaries as well, in terms of having access to the land, and also as our mandate of sovereignty and protection is also for communities up north. And so as you can see, for example, in this map, there's opening of also shipping routes where it's a lot faster to travel from one continent to another, and also access to essential minerals. And so, as Canada is an Arctic nation, what we need to realize and own is that Canada is NATO's Arctic expert. The Arctic file and the Arctic questions that come up, we need to own those solutions, and we need to share that with our colleagues. Nobody else will do that. We need to own it, and now is the time. And the important thing with this is that Canada is the only Arctic country in all of NATO. We are the only ones that have the land mass and the sea mass, with furthermore populated communities, including populated military bases, that have the same time and space and area of operation that is equitable to one of NATO's main adversaries, Russia. That's why it's important. And furthermore, why do we want to be in the cold? Not only to assert our presence, but also it's a tactical advantage. By us operating in the cold, by us being up there, it's a sign of deterrence. And that's what our NATO needs in terms of for global security. And those lessons learned, not only does it apply from a tactical or operational component, but also just includes also medical care, planning, and logistics. And certainly we're pushing a lot more people up north. Op Nanook, that used to happen maybe a couple of months in the year, is now happening almost throughout the year. And furthermore, just recently, I couldn't ask for anything better, there was in the Globe and Mail a 2-page write-up about Canadian Rangers doing a 9-day dismounted patrol, a sovereignty patrol by foot north of Alert. And so certainly we're now pushing and putting a greater presence in the winter and the summer of the Arctic, mounted on tracked vehicles, but also dismounted. And so as we're pushing more people up north, we need to also make sure that we're able to care for them and bring them back home. No soldier wants to be wounded in operations, but unfortunately working in the Arctic is dangerous. We need to be able to look after them. And certainly relying on small local health system, as they're very important and helpful and have that local and especially Indigenous knowledge, is not sufficient. So our goal today, and one of the main questions that we're all trying to answer in this room as well, is that how do we enable our soldiers to be resilient, withstand working in, again, one of these harshest environments? So certainly we're going to have a perspective from a soldier to be able to frame and understand what it's like to work in that kind of environment, analyze the medical logistics component in terms of how do we care for these patients in the north, and importantly, how do we get them back and how do we give them access to definitive care? Working in cold weather operations has multiple factors: the weather, the terrain, personal competency and training. This is an example of what we look for in avalanche. Enemy, which is not just the enemy itself, but sometimes it's the weather as well. And the equipment that we need to be able to trust and we know is going to be able to look after us so that we don't have further injuries. I will now pass on to Master Corporal for us to be able to have a better sense of a boots on the ground experience of what it's like to work in one of the harshest environments. Master Corporal.
In reflecting on today's themes of resiliency in the cold, I'm reminded of an event that happened to me on an exercise a few years ago, one of many during that exercise. I often refer back nostalgically about this event as it describes the many realities of working in the cold as a soldier. We were on day 25 of a 30-day exercise, deep in the Arctic, far above the tree line, and hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest town. 2 nights earlier, 8 of us parachuted into the darkness, landing on a remote frozen lake. The only 2 minutes of effortless bliss up to that point. On the ground, we were skiing on hard snow with a light wind hitting our faces sideways. Our visibility was reduced to 100 meters. I hope I had chosen the right combination of clothing, which consisted of a wool base layer under a thin nylon over white. It was minus 20 with a light wind, and despite the cold, I was sweating from the effort of pulling my 90-pound toboggan, carrying my 50-pound rucksack, a 10-pound vest, and an 8-pound weapon. Choosing the right gloves out of a limited options is critical. Warmth almost always takes priority over dexterity. If I can't use my hands, I can't start a fire, open my rucksack, tie my boots, zip up my puffy. That day I chose thick ones to protect my hands from the wind and the cold. I also needed to consider how it will affect my weapons handling. That day we covered 17 kilometers, a major success compared to the previous day's 6 kilometer. 6 kilometers and about 10 hours of skiing with 8 fit and highly trained men. The difference, snow conditions. When the snow is deep and faceted, every member ends up breaking trail, exhausting the entire patrol. The previous night, we had a patrol member, Eric, pulling 2 toboggans so our lead navigator could move faster. When the lead soldier can break trail effectively, the rest can follow in his tracks and conserve energy. That day's progress of 17 kilometers was a relief as the objective was still far away. During the exercise, we moved at night and rested during the day. Over time, our bodies and minds adapted. The initial fear of the cold and darkness also faded away. We took disciplined breaks every hour. We rested our feet in our backs, hydrated, snacked, confirmed bearings, and made sure to look out for each other. During one of those breaks, I noticed my buddy Odin nodding off, shivering violently. His puffy jacket draped over his head and shoulders only. He was exhausted, so was I. But I wasn't worried. We had trained together for the past 20 days together. And from previous conversations, we both have had to push through similar hardships. I knew he wouldn't fail us, himself for the mission, and that I would reciprocate. Soon after we got the signal to move, we had 3 minutes to pack and go. This was the final leg before needing to find a secure location to rest. After 14 hours on the move, I was exhausted, I was cold. My rucksack, my lifeline, on that day carried the essentials such as my puffy jacket and pants, a shovel, an emergency ration, avalanche safety gear, team medical supplies, poncho, mitts, and a warm hat. My toboggan mood changes with the snow conditions. It hits the back of my boots when we go downhill, becomes an anchor when we go uphill, and rolls over when we cross a side hill. Each time I turn back to fix it, but it's energy that it steals from me. During the last leg, I was sleepwalking, one ski in front of the other, hallucinating from fatigue. I saw people who weren't there. I'm wondering, is it instructors, enemy force, a local hunter? It was just a ghost my mind had created. Eventually, we got the hand signal to move into a listening halt. We sat on our rucksacks silently, barely moving, soaked in sweat, freezing, scanning the darkness for movement. In that moment, you can't afford to put on extra layers. If contact happens, we'd have to move immediately. We waited for 10 minutes, no signs of pursuit. Then came the task of building our shelters. Still in the heavy days, I grabbed my shovel and started digging frantically. Odin and I dug down 3 feet, and luckily that night the snow was soft and light and powdery. With each shovel stroke, I became more alert, waking up from my sleepwalking. When we rest for the day, we have to hide everything: our skis, our pulks, our toboggans. We also dig down a latrine and establish multiple security positions. We have to effectively hide and disappear into the landscape. During the daylight hours, we worked in shifts, some resting, while others did security. And a few melted snow and boiled water. Each of us needs to carry 5 liters before sunset, 1 boiling hot in a thermos, the rest cold water to keep us hydrated for next night's ski. Fuel and water are rationed, just enough to deal with any potential eventuality. Dinner, selected from a limited supply of rations, is one of the few comforts that we have. Luckily that night I pulled out a lamb stew, the team's favorite, and added 2 tablespoons of salted butter. My second pound of butter since the beginning of the exercise. We all carry dense and comforting foods to supplement our diet, such as marzipan, chocolate, nut mix, salami, chips, soft protein bars, mostly all carried in our toboggans. From the corner of my eye, I see Odin pulling security. To stay warm and awake while static, he does 40 squats every 10 minutes. Simon holds the record of 424 hours from last year's winter exercise. In sharing this vignette, I wanted to describe the incredible, challenging event, one of multiple my patrol and I experienced. And from that, I'd like to leave you with some core principles I've learned from working and teaching in the environment. Everything takes longer in the cold. A simple task becomes complex and time-consuming. Moving a casualty, setting up a tent, starting a stove, taking out a sleeping bag, adding warm layers. For the medical people in the crowd, as some of you may know, this is referred to as a storm drill, combining survival and casualty care. Clothing is personal protective equipment. It's not just gear, it's our first line of defense against injury. Effective clothing builds trust in our institution, enhances combat effectiveness, and reduces injuries. Winter training must be progressive and ongoing. And as much as I love the cold, you can't shortcut adaptation to the cold. And you can't force someone to love the cold. First, they have to be willing to be in the cold. Then they have to accept that they will be cold. Then you repeat that cycle for 2 consecutive winters, adding new skills, complexity, and increasing duration, leading to confident, resilient, and resourceful soldiers. Morale matters, and the environment humbles even the strongest personalities. A good attitude is a force multiplier, and we have to seek out those that are motivated by the environment. Every member, and specifically leadership, needs to stay present and focused in order to adapt to changing conditions. You need to react to changes in weather, morale, physical demands, broken equipment, difficult snow, people in trouble, casualties. They all have their challenges and solutions, and all can be learned on a 3-week course. These lessons aren't just tactical, they're human. In the cold, resilience is built over time with consistent, progressive, realistic training. We're all soldiers first, and health services personnel have the additional role of providing medical care. And that requires additional training and resources that we will now be explored in discussing the following lines of effort.
So if you feel like it just got colder in the room, that's just you. We didn't do anything. So the main thing, so how do we meet the challenge? And certainly by having that firsthand exposure of what it's like to operate in these kinds of environment, how do we not only support our medics looking after our soldiers, but the soldiers themselves? And so these are the 3 lines of efforts respectively, that I'll be presenting today, amongst many others, as this is one piece of the conversation. One, for our medics, at progressive cold weather training, you need to be able to survive, thrive, withstand the challenges of the environment so that you're not becoming a casualty yourself. Two, we'll discuss medical logistics in the Arctic to enable point of injury trauma care. And finally, how do we get our soldiers back to definitive care when those initial therapies are not sufficient? The doctrine from the cold weather operations from NATO standard, and I'll highlight this document as well for those who are involved in the field, should be referred to on a regular basis. Believe it or not, it's very easy to read and very accessible as well. And interestingly enough, it was just recently published in October of 2024, because the cold is the kind of environment that we learn the lessons, we forget about it, and then we're having to redo it all over again. But the key thing that I found from this doctrine was the following, and it stems very much with what Master Corporal presented today. Cold weather requires special equipment, techniques, training for troops, otherwise operations and personnel will suffer, goals will become unattainable, and efforts will become matter of simple survival against the elements. Again, we are pushing our forces forward as a sign of, in terms of using it as a tactical advantage, as a sign of deterrence. And so when you're looking at cold weather training, it takes a lot, and that's the whole point of this slide with all these pictures. You need to be able to maneuver and move on different types of platforms. You need to know how to use your equipment, knowing how to feed yourself. In a piece that Master Corporal didn't speak about, but we also train for, what about those contingencies? What about if you fall through the ice and now you're in the icy cold water that now is sucking your temperature from your body 25 times faster than air? How do you get your skis and your equipment off and then build a shelter to warm yourself up when it's minus 50 degrees Celsius outside howling? These are the kinds of trainings that you need to know how to look after yourself even before you can provide medical care. And even from a tactical perspective as well, I'll bring you to the image at the bottom corner where you have that small tent that just lights up like a light bulb in the middle of the Arctic. Picture this being a medic looking after a casualty after pulling a casualty for a few hours. We need to know how to hide, not only as a way of being credible and integrate with our combat arms colleagues, but that also we don't become a target ourselves, as we very much know from the experience in the Ukrainian conflict at this very moment. And through that, as having a basic baseline of training, then after that also in terms of having cold weather subject matter experts peppered within health services would be very much of an advantage as well in terms of having advisors to commanders, mentorship and education for the troops, ensuring that there are individuals that are there to coach the troops to be able to work and operate in this challenging environment, and for some of them dangerous as well. Because if morale goes up, the fighting spirit goes up, and at the same time as well, it allows to meet the commander's main efforts. Having cold weather instructor cadre as well is force protection, because you're minimizing cold weather injuries. As a side note, our Scandinavian and Swedish counterparts have tolerance 0 for cold weather injury on training. If a cold weather injury occurs, it is very similar to medical error in a hospital, i.e. it is documented, registered, investigated, and audited, and especially from an instruction perspective, because this should not happen. And that's the kind of approach that we need to be using to train our soldiers and to protect them as well. And then from that as well, having pipeline as well training for these subject matter experts, such as having specific Arctic related training. This is the kind of stuff that NATO wants to hear from us, where we have a great relationship with the Cold Weather Center of Excellence in Cold Weather Operations that runs the Cold Weather Medic instructor course, but they need that Arctic piece, and that has to come from us. And as well, for these personnel to have qualifications to operate in the Arctic, such as the Arctic Operational Qualification Course and other insert and extract qualifications as well. As Master Corporal said, we need to be able to support and follow the mission using para, using military skiing, land over snow vehicle, or rope work in mountaineering. But we need to access that through the training authority of the Canadian Advanced Warfare Center, and that can be challenging as well coming from health services. So these are some of the efforts that we can do. If we were to talk now about medical logistics in the Arctic and using blood as an example, the reason why I use blood is for two particular reasons. Number one, it highlights the reality of providing care in the Canadian Armed Forces is always a relationship between the civilian and military components. We can't do things alone. The second piece as well is that when it comes to blood, it requires a lot of logistical constraints as well. It has to be kept in very tight temperatures between 1 to 6 degrees Celsius. And also once it leaves the blood bank, it lasts for about 21 to 28 days. So there's this ongoing life cycle of the resource that needs to be managed. It's not impossible to do, and certainly we do it all the time in the operation, but what about in the Arctic per se? And how does that fit in into medical care is that maybe a little bit different from your first aid training that you may have in the room. A soldier uses a march approach, and M, which is the first in our approach, is for massive hemorrhage. And so we need to stop the bleeding because that's the most common cause of battlefield injuries that we see. And the reason why that matters with a list of other interventions there is that we try to prevent blood loss because if there is blood loss that occurs, then the body goes into organ failure or damage and then goes into a shock state. And as the body goes into a shock state, it becomes incredibly dysregulated, and then the body itself can't stop to bleed, let alone with the initial interventions that our medics do. And so because of that, what we are finding and what we are doing as well from a health services perspective, we're enabling our medics to be able to provide blood right at the point of injury. And certainly there's different types of blood products. And so in the hospital tertiary care center, we're finding that as well providing whole blood, so blood containing not only the red blood cells, but also the clotting factors, so the whole kit and caboodle, as we would say, provides a survival advantage to our patients in the operating room, in the trauma suites. And that's within the first 24 hours, let alone 30 days, as you can see on this graph. So certainly this is a delta that needs to be addressed, and certainly there's some efforts that are being made, and I want to highlight some of the researchers involved with Canadian Force CF Health Services in terms of trying to provide, for example, the clotting factors that can be shelf stable, that can last up to 2 years by using what we call dried plasma. And then even more in these pictures is to highlight, there's further modalities that we need to adjust from the cold to just working in a hospital setting, not using glass vials. Glass will break in the cold, just using plastic, for example. But then but that's one thing, we're bringing the clotting factors, but what about the red blood cells? That's the key thing because we need to be able to bring the oxygen to the body so it can heal itself as well so that we don't go into that shock state. Is it by using airdrop, for example, or through, for example, piggybacking on the airborne operations that are exerting because sometimes the plane can't land? We certainly hear a lot about drones, but they're not necessarily the easy fix button. There's challenges in terms of battery life for the drones to fly, and furthermore in terms of de-icing. And what about enough GPS satellite coverage as well for the drones to be able to make its way? That's a challenge in the Arctic as well and in the north. What about using northern blood banks, for example, as the Canadian government is establishing NOSHs as well, these northern hubs as well? Could that be a feasibility product? But all these things to maintain ongoing resuscitation. The last piece, chain of evacuation in the Arctic to provide definitive care. Because the reality is that most of our medics are excellent, but sometimes there's some injuries that just supersedes what they're able to do and what they have in their rucksacks. And so it's one thing to provide care during that chain evacuation, but it's a whole other thing to be able to transport the casualty back to that actual hospital, back to that actual center that will fix the patient. And this is where there's a big capability gap amongst NATO countries in cold weather and as well in the Arctic. So to give you an idea of efforts that are being made in terms of looking into this, our Norwegian colleagues, for example, from the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, last winter carried out a simulated but 100-day exercise behind enemy lines. During that time, from a tactical perspective, they also included a medical scenario where they pulled 2 simulated casualties over a distance of 265 kilometers over 51 hours. That's going back to Master Corporal's point, everything takes longer in the cold and so much more difficult. And then if we were to bring it in the Arctic, all of these lines that you see there in terms of flying routes, those are about 3 to 5 hours long, okay? 3 to 5 hours for a plane to fly your casualty back. But the plane has to get there. And if the weather's not good, it might take 3 to 5 days for the plane to be actually able to land. So this is where we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of transporting these casualties back. And the last piece that I want to highlight as well is that there are only 3 hospitals with surgical capabilities in the north: Iqaluit, Whitehorse, Yellowknife. And if you look at your map, there's a big empty space with no surgical care, and that we need to be able to fill the void. So ideas, for example, Would it be, for example, to bring some of our medical or surgical assets further forward, maybe not on a permanent basis, but temporary as well, embedding into these smaller health centers, for example? Not only does that allow us to support the medical logistics and support the civilian system as well that is involved in terms of looking after our casualties, but importantly as well with our northern communities that are so important in terms of our efforts for surveillance, there's the role of medical diplomacy as well with the local population, ensuring that we still maintain that tight relationship with our communities up north, because the rangers are so essential, as we all know and appreciate, in terms of our efforts right now. What about storing equipment and having caches of medical equipment up in the north? As a small example, as an anesthesiologist, the Arctic air is very dry. Well, the thing with that, so what? The thing with that is that it can dry out the caskets, for example, in my ventilator, and then that machine that is supposed to pump air towards a patient and keep them alive, all of a sudden I have a leak. And the oxygen I'm trying to give to the patient is now just going into the room, into the atmosphere. So how do we cycle our equipment or anything like that? Or another small example as well, what about for our surgeons? In the sense that we all know when we take out our laundry in the wintertime, the air is so much more drier and static. Well, the same thing applies in the Arctic as well. What about the sparks when the surgeon uses a cautery, for example, to do their operations? Does that limit the equipment that they could use? These are all these things that we need to trial, and we can't just trial them through tabletops. We actually have to do it live. And this is, again, to follow on Colonel Charlebois's point, this is where CIMVHR is a great catalyst for these kinds of efforts to be done. So in conclusion, moving forward, our approaches certainly need to be from a clinical perspective, research, policy, and community as well. Momentum is already underway, and there are many efforts that are being done. So rest assured, certainly with the development of an Arctic cold weather medic course that is in development right now. But what we need to do at this present moment is get our medics loaded on courses as well that will give them that proficiency to survive in those cold weather environment. The cold weather operator course is not even a baseline or sufficient for our medics. It needs to be more. So if people are feeling like they need to be able to do something, that should be some of the efforts that we do once we get back to our offices this week. Continue on international collaborations as well with the NATO Center of Excellence in Cold Weather Operation in Elverum, Norway, and certainly working on improved layering system and blood supply in the north. Canada is the NATO Arctic expertise. Cold weather readiness is not optional, it's something that we need to act on now. Protecting the frontline soldiers protects Canada and allows for a more stable, peaceful, and safe world. As a last note, I want to thank and salute all of the serving members in this room and as well veterans as well. Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.